All right. We are in 2 Samuel, and we did not finish chapter 19 last time, so if you would open your Bibles to 2 Samuel 19, that's where we're going to be picking up. And the context of 2 Samuel 19 is David's return from Mahanaim, which was across the Jordan River, to Jerusalem. Now that Absalom's coup is over and Absalom is dead, David is returning back to take control of the kingdom. And the first thing David does is he approaches the tribe of Judah to try to restore his kingship. We talked about several reasons why that would be the case. Judah was, of course, his home tribe, but it was also the tribe where the revolt had originated. It was the central tribe to Absalom seizing power when he began his revolt at Hebron. Included in this sort of olive branch approach to Judah is appointing Amasa as the new commander of his army. Amasa was the commander of the opposing army at first, Absalom's army. But David says, "Oh, Amasa, you're my bone and my flesh. We're related. Here, you can be commander of my army now in place of Joab." And it's designed as kind of a way to say to Judah, no hard feelings. You know, we're not going to hold this revolt against you. We're just going to pardon everybody and move on. Absalom's dead. The revolt's over. We're not going to hold any more grudges. And so it's designed to get Judah back in good graces. But it's also designed to get rid of Joab, because Joab has probably crossed David one too many times by killing Absalom and rebuking him in such an open and disrespectful manner in chapter 19. Well, anyhow, regardless of what we think of this move on David's part, what happens next is as David is going back to Jerusalem, he has a series of encounters with various people. Similar to how he had his series of encounters with friends and enemies as he left Jerusalem in chapters 15 and 16, we have sort of the same thing, or really a miniature version of the same thing, as we proceed through chapter 19. We talked about Shimei and how Shimei apologized to David because he had made a rather poor political move by cursing him on the day David was leaving. Now as David comes back, he apologizes to David and says, "Oh, don't hold this against me." And David promises not to kill him. And then we encounter Mephibosheth, and Mephibosheth claims that, "Oh, when Ziba told you all that stuff about me, it was a lie. I didn't really claim loyalty to Saul or Absalom. I didn't really take his side in the revolt." He says, "My servant deceived me." And we talked a little bit about why Mephibosheth was probably the one telling the truth there, based on, of course, his physical appearance. He's obviously been in mourning since David's absence. And also because of his refusal to take back the land when David says, "You and Ziba can divide the land amongst yourselves." Now we finally come to Barzillai the Gileadite. And let's go ahead and can somebody read verses 31 through 39 of 2 Samuel 19? 31 through 39.
Now Barzillai the Gileadite had come down from Rogelim, and he went on to the Jordan with the king to escort him over the Jordan. Now Barzillai was very old, being 80 years old, and he had sustained the king while he stayed at Mahanaim. He was a very great man. And the king said to Barzillai, "You cross over with me, and I will sustain you with me." But Barzillai said to the king, "How long have I yet to live, that I should go up with the king to Jerusalem? I am now 80 years old, and I distinguish good and bad. Can your servant taste what I eat or what I drink, or can I hear any more the voice of singing men and women? Why then should your servant be an added burden to my lord the king? Your servant would merely cross over the Jordan with the king. Why should the king compensate me for it? Please let your servant return, that I may die in my own city, near the grave of my father and my mother. However, here is your servant Chimham. Let him cross over with my lord the king, and do for him what is good in your sight." And the king answered, "Chimham shall cross over with me, and I will do for him what is good in your sight, and whatever you require of me, I will do for you." All the people crossed over the Jordan, and the king crossed too. The king then kissed Barzillai and blessed him, and he returned to his place.
All right. So Now we look at this guy, Barzillai the Gileadite, and, well, first of all, who is this guy? Who is he? He was a man that helped David. You know, we saw that back in chapter 17 in verse 27. There were several people that helped David. One of them was Shobi, the son of Nahash, who was an Ammonite. One of them was Machir, the son of Amiel from Lo-Debar, who we note was a servant from the house of Saul. And one of them was Barzillai the Gileadite, who until this passage we didn't really know anything about him. But here we learn something new about him in chapter 19. He was really old. Now, why do you think we spend so much attention on this 80-year-old man here? Okay. All right. So is this all this is? A morality tale about respect? Or is there more to it than that? Mark?
Well, come to my mind about this. Number one, Barzillai, being 80 years old, was not retired from serving the Lord. Old age. Frankly, was more capable in some ways of serving the Lord in his old age. And we can elaborate on that.
Right.
But I guess the other thing, too, is that Barzillai, being very old, it seems that he is no longer all that concerned with the world. Because he rejects David's offer to treat him with kindness. I can't taste my food anymore. I can't hear the singers singing. I can't really enjoy life anymore. I'm waiting to move on, basically. Here.
Yeah.
So there was an understanding of the afterlife in the Old Testament that perhaps they knew more than what is elaborated on in the writings that we have. I don't know.
All right. All right.
I guess those two things.
Okay, yeah, there's definitely some things we can work with here. Barzillai, he's near the end of his life. Psalm 90, verse 10, a man's years are 70. If he's really strong, 80. Of course, Moses was probably like 120 when he wrote that, but there's got to be all sorts of amusement on his part. But Barzillai, I'm too old to enjoy the pleasures of this life. I would just be another burden to the king. I would only live long enough to get over to the other side of the Jordan. So why should you reward me for this? He wants to die in his own city near the family tomb. He offers him Himham as a substitute. Now the king, actually later on in 1 Kings chapter 2 and verse 7, David instructs Solomon to show kindness to Barzillai the Gileadite, which raises all sorts of questions. Did Barzillai outlive David? Is David referring more generically to his family? Similar to showing kindness to Saul's house. But there's definitely a lesson here about old age attitudes. Is there ever a point in your life where you're too old for service? Yeah, as long as you're, right, exactly. As long as you still have your faculties. There's never a point where, I'm just too old to help out. I'm going to let other people take care of this. I'll let the young do the work. Sit back and do my own thing. That's not in the Bible. That's not the way these guys act. Barzillai, in his case, the greatest work, the only work that he is remembered for, is what he did when he was 80 years old, in his twilight years. Now Barzillai, the other side of this is rather key to the whole thing. Barzillai is a rare exception in the Old Testament. What happens to most Old Testament characters when they get to their old age? What happens to them? They die, okay, but what do they do right before they die, usually? There seems to be a very common trend among old people in the Old Testament. They what? No, not that. They go off the deep end. They lose their faith, or they get soft in their old age. Solomon, pursued idols in his old age, according to 1 Kings 11. What about Asa, who no longer consulted the Lord, but consulted the doctors for his feet? What about Joash, who suddenly lost sight of all of the instruction of his youth and had the Lord's prophets killed? What about Amaziah? What about Uzziah, who suddenly decides, oh, you know, I want a little bit more than this for myself. I want to be a priest for the Lord. Why are there so many cautionary tales about going soft in old age throughout the Old Testament? Probably because it's a real danger. You know, in fact, there's more on that than there is on the dangers of youthful exuberance and arrogance. I'm not saying that that's completely unmentioned, but there's a lesson there. There's something to think about. Yeah, that's true. Is distress about our impending death, is that, you know, should we be distressed about our impending death, or should we be looking for what we can do to serve the Lord? Something to always think about. Whether one is young or whether one is old, one has an obligation to serve the Lord with all their heart.
But Hezekiah, was it before or after the Lord died, and let him live, that he goes to Babylon?
That's a tough question. There's a little bit of confusion about the chronology of Hezekiah's life, in part because, you know, his illness seems to happen during the Assyrian siege, and also because we're not really sure when the Babylonians showed up, but Merodach-Baladan, from everything we know of history, was not in power when Sennacherib came to Judah, which is a little odd and strange. Now, I don't know what to do with that, but there is some chronological confusion regarding Hezekiah's life. It's interesting, though, that it's portrayed as one of the last things said about Hezekiah. Show the Babylonians all the treasures in my house, which seems to be his most blatant mistake in the whole narrative. So, for what it's worth, anyway. Yes?
The other thing is, Barzillai did this obviously.
Yes.
Because when he was offered something.
Right. Barzillai's entire thinking isn't, what can I get out of this? When he's helping David in chapter 17, it's not, well, I hope David's going to do something for me when this is over. Or, you know, or the way you see other guys acting like Ziba, you know, this is my way of gaining political favor and, you know, sort of making sure that I've appeased whatever side's the winning side. Barzillai doesn't care about that. Barzillai's not looking for some kind of benefit in the Davidic regime. He's just trying to help. For him, service is its own reward. There's a lesson in that too. He's contrasted with Ahithophel. How is he different from Ahithophel? What did Ahithophel do? You know, towards the end of his life. Yeah. Ahithophel, he goes and sets his house in order. And then what does he do? Yeah, he killed himself. He hanged himself, strangled himself. You could translate it impaled himself, which would be kind of gruesome too. But he kills himself. Is the idea. You know, why does he kill himself? Was it because he had been doing all the right things up to that point? Was it because of his fierce loyalty? What was it? What was the reason? Ahithophel was allied with Absalom. And when Absalom didn't take his advice, he killed himself. You know, I guess he didn't want to be executed as a traitor later on, which, of course, seems to have been misguided because, you know, I mean, how does David treat everybody else who was in Absalom's regime when he comes back? Well, he pardons a lot of people. Could Ahithophel have gotten that? Maybe. We'll never know because Ahithophel decided to kill himself before we could get to that point. It's kind of like Judas, you know. Could Judas have been forgiven and, you know, been there on Pentecost? Well, maybe, but we'll never know because he killed himself. He was the son of perdition, destined to perish. But Barzillai's behavior is the opposite of Ahithophel. Ahithophel sets his house in order and takes his own life because of disloyalty. Barzillai makes arrangements for his household, in this case his son, but he doesn't take his own life. He just asks permission to die in peace after his success and loyalty to David. There's very different attitudes about the end of life. Ahithophel views the end of life as something to be seized for himself because he's no longer loyal, well, because he has not been loyal to David. It's a way of escape for him. For Barzillai, it's, I've done this service. There's not really any benefit for me going with the king. Well, he wants simply peace at this point. But, of course, never assume your work is done while there still remains opportunity. As there remains opportunity, make it your ambition to serve the Lord and be pleasing to Him. Any comments or questions on Barzillai before we move on? All right. Well, as David is returning to Jerusalem, Israel and Judah get into an argument. Let's go ahead. Somebody read verse 40 down through verse 2 of chapter 20.
And behold, all the men of Israel, why had our brothers gone away? All the men of Judah answered because the king is so close. Why then are you angry about this matter? Have we eaten at all of the king's expense? The men of Israel and of Judah said, therefore we also have more. Why then did you treat us vice versa? Back our king in the first partially. Every man to his own. All the men
Okay, so, first of all, what's the deal with this dispute here in verses 41 through 43? Why are people getting so upset over this? Not everybody was there, okay? It seems like a political life is nothing but quarrels, either through opposition to the king or because of devotion to him. And what's going on is Judah welcomes David coming across the Jordan, and all of a sudden the other guys in the northern Israel, the 10 tribes or whatever you want to call them, they complain, you didn't let us participate. You didn't invite us too. Why have our brothers, the men of Judah, stolen you away? If they were alive today, they would say, you're trying to run the church. They would have said that. Or something like that. Well, is this a legit complaint? Anybody think here that the folks in Israel actually have a legitimate complaint here? Yeah, it's a little silly, but they take great offense at it. And as Judah welcomes David across the Jordan, this is what goes on. Now the Judeans respond. Number one, the king is our relative. Number two, why are you angry about this? And number three, we don't eat at his expense. There's actually an expression in verse 42, has anything been taken for us? Anybody's Bible have something other than, has anything been taken for us there? The end of verse 42. Yes? Sorry, what was the last bit? Has he given us a gift? Okay, yeah, that's one way to read it, is him giving us a gift. But really the idea here is it's more idiomatic for giving them a tax break. Has the king been showing us special favors just because we're Judah? Has he been exempting us from taxes? Well, of course, the answer to that is no. David hasn't given them any special privileges just for being his home tribe. He even moved the capital into the area of Benjamin to be more centralized. Well, of course, Israel has their own little rebuttal cooked up. There's 10 of us and 1 of you. So that means we have 10 times as much claim on David as you do. Okay? And by the way, why are you treating us with contempt? And by the way, bringing back the king was our idea, not yours. And of course, not to bring up the fact that, by the way, the revolt was your idea in the first place. Well, of course, what happens? The fight breaks out. Judah's words were harsher in verse 43, but Israel's actions wind up being harsher because they start a revolt. They start another revolt in chapter 20 and verse 1. Sheba, the son of Bichri, decides, you know what? We're going to have another civil war. We're going to have another revolt because the last one wasn't good enough. Now, do harsh words justify rebellion? No, harsh words do not justify rebellion. Sheba's words calling for rebellion. Okay, now this is going to rely on knowledge of what we're going to read later in the Old Testament history. But Sheba's words that call for rebellion appear somewhere else. Anybody know where? 1 Kings chapter 12. What was the context of that? What's going on? No. First Kings chapter 12. Well, what major event takes place in 1 Kings? Right, smack in the middle of the book. Yeah, the kingdom is divided. This is the same thing that gets said whenever Rehoboam displeases the people and Jeroboam leads the revolt. We have no portion in David, nor do we have an inheritance in the son of Jesse. Every man to his tents, O Israel. Every man to his tents means, we're not going to come out and follow you anymore. We're going to go back to our own house and do our own thing. So all the men of Israel withdrew from following David and followed Sheba, the son of Bichri. But the men of Judah remained steadfast to their king from the Jordan even to Jerusalem. So we've had a divided kingdom before in 2 Samuel 2, 3, and 4. We're going to have a divided kingdom later in 1 Kings 12, and that one stays permanent. But in 2 Samuel 20, we have another account of the divided kingdom. Israel and Judah have a history of not being able to get along with each other. We have no portion in David, every man to his tents. Well, of course, Sheba's rebellion isn't going to get a lot of press time in the book of Samuel because we just got off Absalom's rebellion, which was chapters and chapters and chapters long, and Sheba's rebellion is just kind of an afterthought. As readers, we should be expected to know what's coming by now. And what's coming? How's this going to end? Why not? How do we know that before we even read the story? Because David was God's anointed. Yeah. I mean, what happens when people rebel against the Lord's anointed? They are destroyed. It's the message of Psalm 2. Why do people, rebel against the Lord and against His anointed one, saying, well, let's cast off their cords. Let's cast off their fetters. Let's do our own thing. Let's plot against the Lord and overthrow Him. Well, the Lord laughs at that. He holds them in derision. Sheba is just another example of Psalm 2 in action. Revolting against David. And so we know, before we even read the ending of the story, how this is going to end. It's like when you read the book of Revelation, and you read about how the beast is defeated, and then in chapter 20, Satan decides to get this whole other army together, and we're barely told anything about it. Because why would we need to know any more about it? We know how the story's going to end. It's like when they make a sequel to a movie, and you don't even need to go see the movie because it's just going to be a rehash of the plot from the first one. Well, that's kind of what's going on here. Sheba, we've told this story before. You don't need to redo everything Absalom did. It's just going to end the same way. That's what Sheba is. He's Absalom Part 2, and that's not a smashing box office success for sure. I don't know. That analogy is probably going too far already. Verse 3, we have a passing side note. David came to his house at Jerusalem. The king took the 10 women, the concubines whom he had left to keep the house, and placed them under guard and provided them with sustenance, but did not go into them. So they were shut up until the day of their death, living as widows. This is the third time in Samuel that we've mentioned these 10 concubines. And, what happens to them? No, they're living as widows for the rest of their life. They're done. Why? Why is that? They're defiled, okay? David arranges provision for them, but he refuses to sleep with them anymore. Probably removes the legitimacy of Absalom's claim. Mark?
Yeah, I think that's part of it. I just wonder how much of Paul's restriction on if a man puts away his wife and she marries another, he cannot take her back. Might be involved as well.
Well, technically,
he did not divorce them. He did not put them away. They were stolen by Absalom. But
it gets into all kinds of complex issues because, polygamy itself is a nebulous subject in the Old Testament. And then it's never portrayed in a good light, but it's never really discussed in the law outside of regulation. For instance, there's a passage in Exodus 21 where if a man takes a wife for himself and decides he doesn't like her, and he takes another wife for himself, he can't reduce the food, clothing, or conjugal rights of the first wife, which, David's providing them with food and clothing, but not the third thing. So there's that to consider as well. I don't know what to make of all that. David know what would happen to them when he left them to guard the house. Like Tamar before them, these violated women become widows, and 10 more women become casualties of conflicts in David's house. It's kind of sad. Well, in verses 4 and onward, now, we're going to get to see the new commander of the army in action. See how he handles Sheba's revolt. The king said to Amasa, "Call out the men of Judah for me within 3 days and be present here for yourself." So Amasa went to call out the men of Judah, but he delayed longer than the set time which he had appointed him. And David said to Abishai, "Now Sheba, the son of Bichri, will do us more harm than Absalom. Take your Lord's servants and pursue him, so that he does not find for himself fortified cities and escape from our sight." So Amasa is running late. And this is the newly appointed commander's chance to prove himself. And he has 3 days to gather the men of Israel and Judah. And how does he do? He kind of drops the ball on this one. Amasa delays long. He doesn't get the job done in time. We're not told why, just that he delayed. Well, David's not happy about this. Now he's having second thoughts about his appointment. So what's he do?
Joab after him.
It doesn't say he sent Joab, though. He sent Abishai. Now, Joab gets involved because Joab is always following Abishai around. Usually the other way around. But David sends Abishai. We're going to delegate this again. He delegates it to the guy who has a propensity for cutting off people's heads. But they need to stop Sheba before he secures a fortified city and turns this into a drawn-out siege word. Well, verses 7 through 13, we have what happens to how the late Amasa becomes the late Amasa. Somebody read verses 7 through 13. Okay, now, why does Joab kill Amasa here? Yeah, that's true. Yeah. A little jealous, maybe. Why does Joab kill Amasa? Is it because he was running late? Got a good reason to kill somebody? You're too slow. That's not really very nice. Distrust, maybe. Well, you were with Absalom, so I don't trust you anymore. Well, that's not what it is. The king's word of pardon should have been enough. Well, Joab's real motivation here. Mark.
Well, I think 2 Kings 2 really gives a lot of insight there. David is giving charge to Solomon. In verse 5, he says, "Now you also know what Joab the son of Zeruiah did to me, and what he did to the 2 commanders of the army of Israel, to Abner the son of Ner, and to Amasa the son of Jether, he killed. He also shed the blood of war in peace. Put the blood of war on his belt, about his waist, and on his sandals, and on his feet." So I think David is Solomon here. That Joab was a jealous man.
Yeah.
He killed these 2 men, these 2 honorable men.
Everything about this is filled with, deceit and wrongness. Joab greets Amasa with his right hand, which greeting with the right hand is a way of showing you're unarmed. You don't have any weapons on you. He takes him by the beard to kiss him, which would have been customary greeting. The problem is that his weapon's in his left hand, and he stabs him with that. He catches him off guard. Very similar to how Ehud assassinates Eglon in Judges 3, right down to the gruesome gut spilling. But and then, of course, he rallies the troops together. There, now that I've killed your leader, I get to be your leader. Now follow me, if you're for David, of course, because this is the loyalty to David party. He kind of paints this whole thing as loyalty to David. Amasa, of course, is not given a proper burial. He's left to wallow in his blood in the middle of the highway. He's treated like a piece of roadkill. And left, oh no, the scene's creating a spectacle, so what are we going to do? Well, we're going to move the body off to the side and cover it with a garment. There. Problem solved. We'll just cover everything up and continue the pursuit. Well, this is, of course, not a pleasant picture on Joab's part. Well, in verse 14, it says, "He went through all the tribes of Israel to Abel, even Beth-Maacah, and all the Beerites. They were gathered together and went after him. They came and besieged him in Abel Beth-Maacah. They cast up a siege ramp against the city, and it stood by the rampart. And all the people who were with Joab were wreaking destruction in order to topple the wall. And then a wise woman called from the city, 'Here, please tell Joab, come here that I may speak with you.' So he approached her, and the woman said, 'Are you Joab?' He answered, 'I am.' She said to him, 'Listen to the words of your maidservant.' He answered, 'I'm listening.' Then she spoke, saying, 'Formerly they used to say, they will surely ask advice in Abel, and thus they ended the dispute. I am of those who are peaceable and faithful in Israel. You are seeking to destroy a city, even a mother in Israel. Why would you swallow up the inheritance of the Lord?' Joab replied, 'Far be it from me that I should swallow up or destroy. Such is not the case. But a man from the hill country of Ephraim, Sheba, the son of Bichri by name, has lifted up his hand against King David. Only hand him over, and I will depart from the city.' And the woman said to Joab, 'Behold, his head will be thrown to you over the wall.' Then the woman wisely came to all the people, and they cut off the head of Sheba the son of Bichri and threw it to Joab. So he blew the trumpet, and they were dispersed from the city, each to his tent. Joab also returned to the king at Jerusalem." All right, so Sheba's mighty revolt, how does it end?
Killed by a woman.
Killed by a woman. Oh, that never happens to anybody, does it? This is a same thing we see happen with Abimelech in Judges 9, I guess. I hadn't thought of that. But yeah, Joab's conspiracy with a wise woman is something we've seen before in 2 Samuel 14. Joab, it's kind of interesting. Would you say that this rebellion is particularly... how would we characterize this rebellion? Was it a long, drawn-out war?
Ill-defined, ill-planned, and ill-executed.
Ill-defined, ill-planned, ill-executed, yeah. Joab, in verse 14, he's going through all the tribes of Israel and rallying people to his cause, which it suggests that Sheba's not getting a lot of support. Even though supposedly he's gathered all Israel, Joab's the one who gathers all Israel to Abel-Beth-Maacah to besiege the city. And then, when we get to the city's stronghold, we see how loyal Sheba's supporters are, right? Well, they cut off his head and throw it over the wall. So he didn't really get a lot of support in his rebellion there. Now, we have the same thing with before. A wise woman intervenes. We're peaceful and faithful. The city's a mother in Israel. Why would you destroy it? And Joab says something interesting. He says, far be it from me that I should swallow up or destroy. What do you think of that statement of Joab's there in verse 20?
Well,
it was hypocritical. Why was that hypocritical? Joab says he doesn't want to destroy anybody. Joab doesn't want to destroy anybody unless you have the job he wants. That's the real hook here. Then these words are out of place coming from a guy that just verses ago murdered Amasa in cold blood. I'm sorry? Yeah. Right. And, like before, it seems like this is the pattern for every revolt in Samuel. Only one person needs to die to end the revolt. Ahithophel told Absalom, you only need to kill David, but Absalom didn't follow that advice. Only Absalom had to die to end Absalom's revolt. Only Sheba has to die to end Sheba's revolt, although they had one other unnecessary death, and that's Amasa. It is more expedient for one man to die than for the whole city to perish. Sounds like something in the New Testament somewhere, in John 11. The people cut off Sheba's head and throw it over the wall, and then in verse 22, they were dispersed, each to his tent. So now everybody in Israel goes back to his tent for real. Sheba said, everyone to your tent, O Israel. But Israel doesn't actually go to their tents until they've killed Sheba. Let's ask a question. How many rebellions take place in this chapter? What? There's two?
Yeah.
Oh, what are these two rebellions? Oh. Yeah. Sheba's rebellion is the one that's getting all the press, but there's another rebellion that takes place in this chapter, and it's tucked right in there.
Might be talking about rebellion in the town against Sheba.
No, it's the rebellion of Joab against David is what we're really seeing here. Because while Sheba rebels against David, he's not the only one. Joab rebels against David's rule too. And you can say, well, how can that be? Joab's loyal to David. Joab is loyal to Joab. Sheba wants to leave David's kingdom so he won't be controlled. What does Joab want to do? He wants to stay in David's kingdom and not be controlled. He wants to stay in David's kingdom, but he doesn't actually want to submit to the rule of the king. He professes loyalty to David, and he kills off rebels, but his loyalty to David does not really extend to respecting David's instructions or his delegated officials, and it sure doesn't extend to not killing people in cold blood that you don't like in a never-ending quest for power. So is Joab truly loyal to the king, even though he calls him Lord, Lord? Not really. What did Jesus say? Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but he who does the will of my Father who is in heaven will enter. Where's Joab in the story? If David is, if we're going to view David as a type of Christ, what is Joab? Well, Joab is that man who professes loyalty. But in his heart, he has one loyalty, and that is to himself. He has one treasure, and that is the treasure he lays up on earth. And his deeds of loyalty, are they going to save him when the day of reckoning comes? No. Joab will get his comeuppance when we get to 1 Kings chapter 2. That's the lesson I think we're supposed to learn from Joab more than anything else, is that just because one professes loyalty in name, and just because someone does a few loyal deeds for the Lord, does not make them loyal to the Lord. He must possess our hearts as well. If we are truly submissive to the Word of Christ, that means that our submissiveness to Christ doesn't play games selectively. We don't pick and choose what we're going to do that Christ has said. We don't follow Christ only when it's convenient for us. We don't see Christianity as merely a means to our own personal advancement. We see it as the very defining feature of our lives. That's what sets Joab apart as not truly loyal as a servant of the Lord. And verses 23 through 26 conclude this section of Samuel. Joab was over the whole army of Israel. Benaiah the son of Jehoiada was over the Kerethites and the Pelethites. Adoram was over the forced labor. Jehoshaphat the son of Ahilud the recorder. Shiva was scribe. Zadok and Abiathar were priests. And Ira the Jairite was also a priest to David. Next time, we'll look at chapter 21. And chapter 21 begins really kind of the last section of 2 Samuel, kind of the epilogues to the book in some way. So we'll look at that. Anybody have any thoughts or comments they want to share before we conclude? All right, we'll pick up with chapter 21 next time.